Higalanam, higalana, ufros chavivi alai, esukas shlomecha. Higalana, higalana, ufros chavivi alai, esukas shlomecha. Higalana, higalana, ufros chavivi alai, esuka shlomecha. Higalana, higalana, ufros chavivi alai, esuka shlomecha. Higalana, higalana, ufros chavivi alai, esuka shlomecha. So nice to be back with everybody. Whenever you join, I'll be excited. It's been a couple of weeks since we had our last Lunch and Learn. Soul food is an attempt to bring a little bit of Torah into the middle of your work day, to take a moment to breathe and to center yourself and to come back to the present moment and to learn some of the wisdom from a few of our sacred teachers. The one that we've been studying so far this year, those of you who have been with us, this is the 8th class exploring the teachings of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, otherwise known as the Ramchal, who wrote prolifically before dying very young. But his most well-known work is the Mesilat Yesharim, the Mesilas Yesharim, which is the path of those who are straight, or the straight ones. A book, a manual, really, of self-development and spiritual evolution. So we've made our way through the first 2 chapters, the Hakdama, the introduction, Hakdamas of the Mechaber, where the Ramchal spoke to us about the purpose of the book and the need for the book, being not a book that would teach us something new, he said in maybe one of his most famous statements. I didn't come to teach you something that is not well known, but something that you know already, but that you forget. And so this book, the Ramchal's book, Mesilat Yesharim, was intended to be a companion, a best friend. And so something that needed to be learned over and over again. And the second chapter, Biveur Chovas Adam Be'olamo, like our basic responsibility here in this world. And Ramchal set up in that chapter his case for looking at the world as a place where there are many, many, many challenges to our awareness and to our service of God. That Rabim Advarim Amarchikim et Adam, there are things that every day are pulling us away from knowing who we are and knowing by extension who God is. And so the Ramchal wanted to make a claim that there's work to be done in this world. As we said, I think in the last broadcast, or maybe the one before, where a lot of broadcasts, the Ramchal basically says that I think human beings are endowed with the capacity to wake up. And we said that our Buddhist friends would call this being alive a precious incarnation. Like here we are, we find ourselves in this body, in this space. And every morning we are awakened. We don't wake up, we are awakened. Will is within us. We have no will over our own will. We are embedded in a mystery within a mystery within a mystery, and most of us spend our whole lives ignoring that mystery to our detriment. So the deepest structure of the Ramchal's teaching is to awaken us. awaken us to the life of prayer, the life of service, the life of self-evolution, transcendence and translucence versus transparency. We want to become transparent to the divine. So we're going to pick up today, finally stepping into the first stage of the stages of the Ramchal's curricula. On page, I'm hoping that people have these pages, and if they don't, they'll have to email me. Hine, page 29, Inyan HaZihirut, Hu sheyeh ha'adam nizhar b'ma'asav uve'inyanav. Klamar, mizboinen u'mefakech al ma'asav u'dirachav, hatovim hem imlo, levilti azov nafsho lesakanas ha'avadon chas v'chalila, v'lo yilech b'mahalach hergelo ki'iver ba'afila. The idea of watchfulness, says the Ramchal, is for a person to exercise caution in their actions and in their undertakings. That is, to deliberate and watch over one's actions and one's accustomed ways to determine whether or not they are good, so as not to abandon one's soul to the danger of destruction, God forbid, and not to walk according to the promptings of habit as a blind man in pitch darkness. Ki acharei הנה זה דבר שהשכל יחייבהו ודאי. כי אחרי שיש לאדם דעה והשכל להציל את עצמו ולברוח מאבדון נשמתו, איך ייתכן שירצה להעלים עיניו מהצלתו? אין לך פחיתוס והוללות רע מזה ודאי. Says that this is demanded by one's intelligence, one's consciousness, for considering the fact that we possess the knowledge and the reasoning ability to save ourselves and to flee from the destruction. Is it conceivable that we would willingly blind ourselves to our own salvation? There is no degradation or stupidity or foolishness that is worse than this, says the Ramchal. So basically the Ramchal begins, it's an amazing thing. He begins the program here with letting us know we have to know what the purpose of our existence is. Great. We need to know what the purpose of our existence is. We begin with Chovat Ha'adam Be'olamo. Like, why are we here? What's the point? Is there a point? What's the meaning of this thing called life? What are we doing here? What brought us here? Who brought us here? What's the point? And then the Ramchal offered an answer. He said this world is a world, it's a prosdor, it's a vestibule. We're working here to become enlightened so that we don't have to, we can have our reward in the world to come. Or to put it differently, we want to get off of the wheel because it doesn't make sense that he would want us to actually become enlightened here in this world if reward and punishment were the Ramchal's world. It's not what he wants. He says that there's the world to come, great. What he means to say is that there's a deeper structure to this world and we can access it through following this program. And then what's the first step? You know, first steps are always, you know, the hardest. What's the first step? What's the first step? So Ramchal says the first step, based on this teaching from a great scholar, a great wisdom master, Pinchas ben Yair, is Zihirut. Zihirut means to be aware, to be mindful, to be careful, to be watchful, to be awake, says the Ramchal. To be awake is to be aware of who we are and where we are. And based upon that awareness, to promise ourselves to live with our eyes wide open, to see what's there, to be Zahir. Ramchal says that if we don't use Zihirut, if we're not willing to look at things, we're even more foolish than the blind person, he says, who can't see, because we can see, but we make ourselves blind. We're ma'alim ayin, where we act as if we didn't see something. We act as if we didn't see something. What does it mean? We act to avoid having to know or having to see something. The sight of it, if it challenges us so deeply that we prefer to run our whole lives without zihirut, to see. It's us in a relationship where we won't bring up the bad issues. It's us in our own patterns, our own autopilots, where we just turn it on. We go through the motions. So to be on autopilot, to be someone who is dialing it in, to be someone who doesn't want to see, doesn't want to be Zahir, says the Ramchal, then you can't start. Right? You can't start unless you begin in that place. To begin in the place of Zihirut, he says, is to live in the world of what he said, what the Ramchal says in other places, is the world of post Eitz Hadas Tovara, after having eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in a world where good and evil, where pleasure and unpleasure, where positive and negative are interwoven. If we don't have Zihirut, if we don't have watchfulness, mindfulness, if we're not willing to be awake, to come out of forgetfulness, the opposite of mindfulness is forgetfulness. I was with an amazing teacher, Rabbi Jordan Appel from the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. We were all on a retreat together this past week in California, a retreat called Kivun, Kivvun. Kivun is an 18-month training course in Jewish mindfulness and prayer, and I was one of the teachers. And we were sitting, and Jordan was teaching, Rabbi Appel was teaching about Shamor v'Zachor, the two aspects of Shabbat that are the two words used in different places for the Ten Commandments. In the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments appears twice in the Bible. Once in the book of Exodus, once in the book of Deuteronomy. And in the places where in the Ten Commandments we are told to be about the commandment of Shabbat, about keeping Shabbat, so to speak, two words are used, two different words. One is Shamor, which means to watch over. One is Zachor, to remember. And we were talking, and Jordan was teaching about the relation between watchfulness or observing and remembering, Zachor, which means to remember. Shamor means to watch over. And he quoted the Talmud that says, when speaking about tzitziot, about the fringes that are worn on the end of a prayer garment, of a prayer shawl, that seeing will bring you into a place of remembering, and and remembering will bring you to a place of action. And that zechira, remembering, right? If we're forgetful, we put up something where we'll remember. So I see it. I see Reb Zalman on the wall, and I remember my Rebbe and how much he loved me, and how much love he gave to the world, and who he was, and why I became a rabbi. I'm just looking at his picture now and describing it. Or I see a picture of my boys, and I remember them. They're not far from my mind, or my heart, but I see them on the wall. Or I see a mezuzah, and I say, oh, I'm walking into a room. Remember that every moment is a room, and every moment has a mezuzah. Every moment in time has its own, quote unquote, threshold that we have to cross over into. Every step forward is a step away from. It could be potentially a step away from mere habitual living, right? Stepping over the precipice and into freedom. So we have all of these visual cues that help remind us. It can, kind of like tying a little ring, or a string around your finger, or having an alarm go off. That would be maybe the analog, like the audio reminder, not just seeing and remembering, but the hearing and remembering. Whatever it is that we need to remember, because by definition we're forgetful. That's what it is. To be a human being is to forget. And some of that actually is a good idea. It's good to have some things working on autopilot. If I had to think all the time about how, all the micro moments that go into putting on my shoes, that could take a long time to get out of the house. I mean, all right? It could take a long time to do a lot of things. So thank God we have all kinds of habit patterns that are underneath the radar, but that's the rub, because those small habit patterns might work, but then there are bigger habit patterns that don't work. Bigger habit patterns that when they are forgotten become assumptions about the way life is, and slowly gratitude leaks out of our lives, appreciation leaks out of our lives. We have all of these places where insulation by habit, right, is not healthy. Right? The sun rises, the sun sets. My nervous system is working. Wow, that's a miracle. Oh, I have a habit of getting angry. Or I have a habit of forgetting all kinds of things. So the Ramchal begins by saying all spiritual evolution, all spiritual curricula, all spiritual systems and development, frames must begin with awareness. Like a commitment to being zahir, a commitment to being watchful, a commitment to being someone who is awake and who has eyes to see and isn't like an iver ba'afilah, like a blind person groping, who willfully ignores, willfully will not be reminded, willfully wants to ignore and to push away and to avoid remembering. I'll do anything not to remember. והעושה כן. הנה הוא פחות מהבהמות ומהחיות אשר בטבעם לשמור את עצמם, ועל כן יברחו וינוסו בכל מה שיראה להם היות ומזיק להם והולך בעולמו בלי התבוננות אם טובה דרכו או רעה. הנה הוא כסומה הולך על שפת הנהר אשר סכנתו ודאי עצומה ורעתו קרובה מהצלתו, כי אולם חסרון השמירה מפני העיוורון הטבעי או מפני העיוורון הרצוני, דהיינו סתימת העיניים בבחירת וחפץ אחד הוא. Says the Ramchal, that one who acts willfully to not know what they need to know, to blind themselves to what is vision, what they need to see, to stop up their ears from hearing what they need to hear. One who does this is lower than beasts and wild animals. In other words, we're not in our neocortex. We're kind of in the deep place of our animal consciousness. We're even lower than animals who by very nature, they protect themselves and flee and run away from anything that seems to endanger them. But one who walks in this world without considering whether their way of life is a good way of life or a bad is like a blind person walking along the seashore who is in great danger and whose chances of being lost are far greater than those of his being saved. For there is no difference between natural blindness and self-inflicted blindness, the shutting of one's eyes as an act of will and desire. That is a very, very strong statement. There's no difference between natural blindness, he says, and self-inflicted blindness, shutting one's eyes as an act of will and desire. I mean, it's such a powerful insight into the way that we close off our eyes. We willfully decide not to see or not to know something. Now, there are people who are who, by definition, don't. It's not as if they live their lives blind, but they never actually thought about it, or that's not who they are. They don't give these things thought. But Ramchal is writing this book to remind everyone who reads it to consider whether our way of life or the things that we do is it working for you? I mean, that's the way they would say it in our generation. It's like you look at your friend and you say, "Hey man, how's that working for you?" That whole posture of being, living your life the way that you live it, or that habit pattern that you have. How does that work? What's good about that? How's it working? Is it really working? Is it really working the way that your pattern with in intimacy? Is it really working in your pattern at work with your boss? And is there something deeper here that you want to look at? Do you really want to see? What do you want to see? What do you really want? What's your outcome? What do you want? What do you want? And what's detracting from that? What's distancing us from those things that we want, that we want to be? And the Ramban wants us to know that we really want God. So we want wholeness, we want healing, we want love. So it keeps us from those things. והנה ירמיה היה מתאונן על רוע בני דורו ובני היותם נגועים בנגע המידה הזאת, שהיו מעלימים עיניהם ממעשיהם בלי שישימו לב לראות מה הם לעשות אם להיעזב. ואמר להם אין איש ניחם על רעתו לאמור, כולו שב במצאתם כסוס שוטף במלחמה. He quotes Jeremiah. He says Jeremiah has complained about the evil of the men of Jeremiah's generation, about their being affected with this affliction, the blinding of their eyes to their actions, their failure to analyze them in order to determine whether they should be engaged in or abandoned. He says about these men in Jeremiah 8:6, no one regrets his wrongdoing, saying they all turn away in their course as a horse rushing headlong into battle. Says something amazing. He says that Jeremiah is alluding here to those people of his generation who ran on the impetus of their habits and their ways without leaving themselves time to reevaluate their actions and ways. And as a result, falling into evil without even noticing it. He says this is one of the clever ways. Zos be'emes achat mitachbulos ha'yetzer hara ve'armato lachbid avodaso b'tmidus al libos b'nei adam ad shelo yishaer lehem ravach lisbonim v'stakel be'ezet derech hem olchim ki yodeh hu she'ilulei hayu samim libam kimat kat al derechim v'adai she'miyad hayu matchilim linachem mimaseyem v'ayis acharota ha'oleches misgaberes be'mat she'hayu ozvim achet legamri. Right? He says this craziness of living a life where you don't look, you just keep going. Don't look, keep going. I don't know, I'm 30 years old, I don't know, keep going. I was told that this is what I should be doing with my life. This is what the culture tells me I should do with my life. This is what the religion tells me I should do with my life. This is what Rabbi Ingber tells me I should do with my life. This is what everybody tells me to do with my life. But I don't want to listen to anyone but those ones that have accepted, and now I'm not going to take in any information from anywhere. I'm just going. Kisus shotef b'milchama. It's like a horse, like that is, that has its blinders on so that it can't be distracted. It has a unitive purpose towards that thing that it thinks it wants, but it's not going to ask the question, hey, how do I know that's what I want? Is that really what I want? And when am I going to wake up and say that I'm only doing that because my father told me, my mother told me, my society told me, I told me when I was 5 years old, and I haven't checked back in with anybody. I don't have any mirrors. But I'm just keeping my eyes focused on the prize. So I don't know how many people, there are 5 of you here, but I don't know how many people are going to watch this. But how many of you people have seen the movie Whiplash? I'm not going to give it away. If you did see Whiplash, great. If you didn't see it, I recommend it. I don't really get a chance to see movies, but on the way back from LA, I told you all that I was at this prayer conference, and I saw this movie Whiplash about an aspiring, creative, and talented drummer at the most prestigious music school in the country. It was here in New York City, and he had a very authoritarian and some would say very abusive music teacher, who was trying to bring the most out of him. And at one point, you see him practicing by himself. He's trying to be as fast as Charlie Parker or as Buddy Rich, or he's trying to be this incredible drummer. He's drumming, and he's in this room, he's drumming, and his hands are beginning to bleed. And he's going, and he's a mush. He's in a craze. Because he's got a purpose, which is to become the best drummer ever, the best musician, is to bring his greatness out, which is beautiful. But he has no mirrors. He gets lost in a house of mirrors. He gets lost in a world of why am I doing this? But not willing to look at it. What am I doing this for? Making myself meshuggah. So he wants to argue that it doesn't matter what you do. I mean, he actually does think it matters what you do, but you need to be zahir. He says you need to be able to ask yourself, am I living a life of watchfulness, a life of of introspection, of self-reflection, of getting feedback from others. So all of our spiritual programs, all of our psychological programs, cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic, archetypal, whatever they are, if we don't have the ability to self-reflect, to look at ourselves honestly, and if we can, and also know that we can't really look at ourselves fully honestly, that we need both a combination of self-reflection and reflection from the outside. If we're not committed to reflection in its broadest sense, to being aware of how we hold ourselves in the world, we're not going to be spiritually successful. It begins with zihirut, begins with awareness, it begins with looking at what's happening, what we're not doing, what are our patterns. And the Yetzer Hara says does something fantastic. The evil inclination, or otherwise known as that which in us is afraid, fear. Fear keeps us, he says, moving all the time. Just like Pharaoh said, made all the slaves in Egypt, kept them moving. Tichbad alehem avodah, make them work all the time. And keep them busy, so they don't stop. Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. On page 30, that's what the Ramchal says. Tichbad alehem avodah. Tichbad avodah al anashim shaya mitkaven shelo levad shelo leaniach lehem revach klal level tinu lev o yasimu etza negdo ela היה משתדל להפריע ליבם מכל התבוננות בכוח התמדת עבודה הבלתי מופסקת. This was Pharaoh's strategy. This is the inner Pharaoh strategy. Make the work so heavy. He wasn't just saying, let it be, right? It wasn't merely to deprive them of all the leisure so that they would not come to oppose him or plot against him, but he wanted to strip their hearts of all thought by means of the enduring, interminable nature of their labor. Wow. This reminds me so much of Viktor Frankl's, Erich Fromm's book and other books about the escape from freedom. That we keep ourselves so busy. It wasn't just about the 50s, 60s. It's what our lives are like. We don't stop. And the very means of technology that were intended to make our life easier actually have made it much fuller and more occupied, busier. The Yetzer Hara keeps us busy. The Yetzer Hara, that which in us is the inner Pharaoh, says, don't stop. Whatever you say, whatever you do, don't stop. Don't think, don't feel, don't know. Keep forgetting. Stay numb. That way you won't have to actually make changes, because change is scary. Ken ki eitzas hayetzer hara mamash al bnei adam ki ish milchama hu melumad be'armimus. Says this is the eitzah, this is the advice of the Yetzer Hara, the inner place of fear to all people. For that which in us that is fearful is a ish milchama. Is very, it's a warrior and is well versed in the arts of deception. You can't get, there's no way to avoid or to get away or to be free or escape from that Yetzer Hara, from that the deceiving, self-satisfied voice, except with great wisdom and a big perspective and a broad outlook. I'm going to stop at this point. This is the beginning of the second chapter, paragraph on page 30. Coming to awareness, coming to consciousness is painful, says Carl Jung. I spent 4 days stopping and realized how much I was running here in New York for the last year. All of a sudden, it was like I had all this unmetabolized experience that it felt so good to metabolize, but I also could feel how scary it was to stop and to feel. We move from thing to thing. We even sing songs in shul that are full of longing and yearning, and then within more than in like one breath or two breaths, and we're already singing another song. We don't even feel it. Our lives are like that. We move from thing to thing. The Ramchal says that the beginning of the path to Ruach HaKodesh, to Holy Spirit, to great spiritual vitality, begins with zehirut, to be careful, to be mindful, to be aware, to stop and ask questions. So I want to bless you on this day before Purim, and the day before Erev Purim, right? It's Erev Purim. As the power of the Megillah, the power of the reading of how a story turned with zehirut, with watchfulness, where we were able to see what we didn't see before. That Haman comes from the Haman story is, the Talmud says Haman appears in the story by the Garden of Eden. Did you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? That's Haman, Hamin. Did you eat from it? And we all have. And the Ramchal is trying to help us get back to a place where we're before that. And so he's introducing us to zehirut. And I'm introducing you to zehirut. May God give us the strength to be watchful, to be aware, to look at ourselves clearly, to be willing to stop and to really do hitbonenut, to contemplate what it is that we're doing in this life. May that inner reflection and honesty, emet, help make us better people, better human beings, better Jews. Amen. Chag Sameach, a Freilichen Purim.